What's going on, guys? Pleiades Payout 7 has just wrapped up, and this is usually one of the smaller online hat format tournaments, but it is one of the events that you can actually win a cash prize if you make it into one of the top spots. So for people that enjoy that type of gameplay, it is very nice. And this event only got 11 players, and usually, as I mentioned, the Pleiades Payout is one of the smaller events. And I've considered not really covering these types of events anymore that are this small, but I figured at least by showing off, the breakdowns for these events and what decks entered, along with any tech choices and things like that, you guys can still get an update on what people's minds are at for current modern hat format, or what cards people are wanting to try out more, and different things like that. So for the time being, I am going to continue showing off some of these smaller events. You can let me know what you think in the comment section though, and hopefully in the future these events will pick up more as hat format gets more popular. And in general, if you guys are looking to actually play in these events, you should join the Hat Alliance Discord server. I will have that linked in the video description, so you can go find that link, click on it, and join and be able to play in events like this or just other online hat format tournaments, as some of the other ones like the NAWCQ Monthly tends to get 50 to 60 plus players, so there are much larger hat format events that do occur as well. But anyways, as usual, I want to go over what decks actually entered this event and look at the top deck list, see if there's any cool techs or interesting things like that. As I mentioned, 11 players, and I should have the top 4 deck lists for you guys, so let's get straight into this. So starting out, the biggest chunk on this graph is 2 Spellbook, 1 Geargia, 1 Bujin, 1 Evilswarm, 1 Firefist Traptrix, 1 Sylvan, 1 Ghostrick, 1 Artifact Traptrix, 1 other. This is actually a Synchron artifact deck. I do have some gameplay from this that I'm going to show off in the future, as well as I believe they did also top this event, so I should have the deck list for that as well. And the last being a Twilight. So the biggest takeaway from this is Spellbook was actually the largest slice, whereas usually, Geargia or Artifact Traptrix would take up the top spot. So that, I think, is the most interesting thing. Also, just seeing a kind of nice diversity. Luckily, it wasn't like an event where even with just 11 players that everyone was on like the same deck. So even now, there was a good amount of diversity in this event. Obviously, we don't see any of the Dragon Ruler type decks, so no Lightsworn Ruler, Mythic Ruler, or anything like that. Again, no Infernity either, so that's like something that people always point out. Also, no Mermail either. Mermail had just topped the last event, so not seeing any of that, but in general, 11 players, you can't expect every deck to actually enter. So I guess that's my big takeaway from that. You guys can let me know any other big things that you might notice from this, or just, comments that you guys have on the breakdown for this event. But anyways, let's look at what decks actually topped. So here we have the top 4. In first place was Bujin. In second place was Spellbook. And third and fourth was Evilswarm and that other deck piloted by Arim. Obviously, he likes to play a lot of, interesting decks, and I always think that's cool. I like seeing people try to innovate the format and stuff, and so this should be extremely interesting. Along with just in general, seeing Evilswarm top again is nice, seeing Bujin take a win is nice, and even, Spellbook taking up a spot. So let's get started on this, honestly. I think a big thing is also just having a top 4 breakdown for an event with only 11 players. I think that's kind of a strange thing that we've been seeing a lot more of the smaller events having more of the top deck lists. And I think that's kind of cool. At least we can see the decks. But yeah, let's get straight into it with this first place Bujin list. So here is the list, and this player, I believe, topped not the last NAWCQ Monthly, but I think it was NAWCQ Monthly 36. And at quick glance, just looking over this, I believe their build is, I don't think it's the same, but it's pretty similar to the list that they brought last time. So I'm first going to just go through the whole entire list card by card, and then we can talk about what changes I see or anything like that. So starting off with the monsters in the main deck, we see 1 Harume, 2 Mikazuchi, 3 Yamato, 3 Crane, 2 copies of Hare, 1 Quillen, 1 Sinew, 2 copies of Turtle, and 2 copies of DD Crow, and then the honorary extra copy of Original Honest. After that, we see 3 copies of Carnation, 3 Tenki, 2 Chalice, 2 Lance, 3 Duality, and 3 Upstart Goblin for the spells. And for the traps, we see 1 Bottomless, 3 Breakthrough Skill, 1 Warning, and 1 copy of Torrential. Now, looking at the main deck, I think if I'm remembering correctly, and I look over so many lists, so I might be forgetting or maybe getting it even confused with other lists, but I'm pretty sure the last time I saw their list, they were on only 1 copy of Mikazuchi, and then they were playing 2 copies of Crane, and I think they may have been playing the 3rd copy of Crow in the main. I think that's the biggest change, and we do see from time to time decks either choosing to play the 2 copies of Mikazuchi or 2 copies of Harume, so seeing, that isn't as different. And I guess the other big thing is they are really sticking with this copy of Sinew, which is basically kind of like an Honest from the graveyard for your Beast Warrior type Bujin monsters. I'm pretty sure it's Beast Warrior, not just generic Bujins, as usually, the graveyard effects are for your Beast Warrior type ones. But anyways, yeah, seeing that they're sticking with that is pretty cool. Just having an extra option is always nice, especially it being in graveyard, so you can, in theory, be able to set some of your actual back row and still have a Crane-like effect, but not needing it in hand, obviously. So say you top deck Yamato in a bad situation, you can add Sinew, send Sinew, whereas with Crane, you'd have to add Crane and discard Crane if you had no other cards in hand. So the Sinew is a very cool card. Choosing the 2 copies of Crow, again, usually Bujins will play 3 total hand traps of actual non-engine hand traps or the Honest. So I guess that's a big thing to note there. 3 copies of Carnation, some people like 2, some people like 3. I think the fact that this deck is really grindy, sometimes having 3 can be nice, and we are seeing that as kind of the standard moving forward. And other than that, nothing else really stands out. Looking at the side deck, they do side the 3rd copy of Crow and 3 Max C, so always good to see the extra copy along with, in general, the other main hand trap of the format. After that, we see 1 Dark Hole. I think they might have actually been maining this the last time I looked at one of their lists. 1 copy of Mind Control, 3 MST, and 1 copy of Twister. This is another card that it's kind of just extra copies of MST, but specifically for face-up cards, face-up spell and traps, which can hurt this deck a lot. Things like, for example, Macro, Defissure, even, things like DNA Surgery to switch their typing, that can be pretty big against this deck. So that's always nice to see. And then obviously the 2 DNA Surgery, just because turning any of your Bujins into Beast Warriors helps with your graveyard ones, or even your Cranes and stuff. And then 3 copies of Debunk, very standard. After that, for the extra deck, we see 1 Dweller, 1 Kagutsuchi, 3 copies of Susano, 1 Omega, 1 Diamond Direwolf, 1 Exciton, 1 Cowboy, 1 101, 1 copy of Ragna Zero, 1 Black Ship, 1 copy of Heartland Draco, 1 copy of Crazy Box, and the 1 copy of Paladynamo. All of that looks pretty good, so let's move on to second place. Next up, we do have Spellbook, and obviously looking at this deck really quickly in terms of the main deck, it does look like the standard of what Spellbook has been playing recently. I know there's been a big divide on some people liking the Temperance builds versus others not, though I would say we have been seeing Temperance top a lot more lately than the older builds that would play things like Pot of Duality and stuff. So I want to say that this is becoming a standard. I know there is the argument that, based on the size of this event, this one specifically only being 11 players, that doesn't really tell you anything. But in general, until we have some of those bigger events like the Moral Tag Monthly again, we will see, though I'm pretty sure it did just top the last Moral Tag Monthly. And again, this is the build you are just seeing more often. It can be controversial, but it is what it is. We'll just have to see once hat format takes off more. But anyways, they are on the 3 copies of Crow. This seems to be what people prefer the most, though it's either between this or Max C, and usually they side whichever one they aren't maining, though at quick glance here, it doesn't even look like they're on the Max Cs, which is a trend we saw from the last event of some builds not even choosing the Max Cs. Maybe it's because, right now the format is a little slower. Well, I guess it's kind of mid-rangey actually, because we are seeing some Mythic rulers in other events, along with we've seen a couple Infernity here and there. We've seen some Sylvan, for example, in this event. We even saw Lightsworn ruler the last time. So it's kind of interesting to see that, but even then, I guess the DD Crows hurt a lot of those decks equally as much. For example, DD Crowing a Lightsworn name can be very big, or say hitting a Lone Fire that was, targeted with a Soul Charge or something can be kind of big. So I guess, the DD Crow kind of serves its purpose as well, and I've always said it, but I think DD Crow is just a slightly better card than Max C in most cases in hat format specifically. After that, though, we see the 3 High Priestess, 3 Justice, 3 Blue Boy, and 3 copies of Temperance. I think the last build we had looked at was only playing 2 copies of Temperance, and I think they may have been on 2 copies of Max C or 2 Crow. I can't entirely remember, but a lot of times I think the more standard that we've seen top more is on the 3 copies. For the spells, we see 1 Book of Moon, 3 Crescent, 2 copies of Eternity, 1 Fate, 1 Life, 2 copies of Power. We saw this with the last list that topped, and really it just comes down to, do the people want to go with the second copy of this or the third copy of Wisdom? Obviously, this player chose to go with the 2 and 2, which is completely fine, and the 3 copies of Secrets. After that, we see 2 copies of Master and 2 copies of Tower, extremely standard. And unlike the other build that played a lot more traps, this plays a more standard lineup for what a lot of the Spellbook decks were playing. I don't know if necessarily these traps specifically, well, I guess I should say the basic staple traps of the format are going to be your Bottomless, Compulse, Warning, and Torrential, but then really these slots here, these 2 Fiendish Chains, are usually going to be either Fiendish Chains, Breakthroughs, or Trap Tricks, Trap Hole, Nightmares. But in general, the list looks really solid. The deck does what it wants to do for the most part. So let's move on to that side deck. Here we do see them choosing to go with the 2 copies of Cyber Dragon. This isn't completely unheard of. I think it's pretty cool. It helps into any of the machine type matchups, specifically being Geargia, and as well just having a big body on board sometimes is nice. And the 1 copy of Kaiku. As I mentioned, no copies of Max C on the side. That is a little alarming, but again, it's not unheard of. Next, we see the 1 Dark Hole, 1 Dimensional Fissure, and 3 MST. And then they are siding quite a lot of traps, being the 2 copies of Breakthrough, 2 Malcat, 2 copies of Rivalry, and the 1 Soul Drain. Looking at the extra deck, it for the most part tends to be standard. Here we see 2 copies of the Chimera Tech, obviously pairing with the Cyber Dragons, 1 Daigusto Phoenix, 1 Downard, 1 Gaia Dragon, 1 Alucard, 1 Succubus, 1 Herald, 1 Hierophant, 1 copy of Levier, 1 Draco Sack and Big Eye, 1 copy of Nightmare Shark, 1 Shining Elf, and 1 copy of Soul of Silver Mountain. Overall, looks really good, and let's move on to the next deck. Next up, we have the Artifact Synchron deck, and my idea of what I can take from this list, looking at it right away, is obviously it's playing 42 cards, which, that's something that I think more decks could honestly take advantage of. I think there's a lot of the more rogue options in hat format, or in general, we've seen it with like Mermail that go over 40 cards. I think this format can completely be okay with that type of thing, especially when you don't really want to hard open things like the artifacts. So I think playing a few extra cards is no problem at all. But the main idea of this deck, obviously you can play the control control game with the artifacts, but it's also just trying to turbo into level 5 synchros in order to then either use those level 5 synchros or be able to overlay and make rank 5s. So anyways, starting out with the monsters, we see 1 copy of Beagletech, 3 copies of Moraltech, and 1 copy of Scythe, just your generic package of artifacts. Next, we see 3 copies of Junk Synchron, 3 Mathematician, 3 Synchron Explorer, and 1 Synchro Fusionist, and then the 3 copies of Max C. So what I kind of like about this is I feel this is a deck that takes like usually 1 turn to set up, and then can be a lot more explosive on the following turn. And so I like the idea that you can go like Mathematician or something, and the nice thing about this is 1, it can force something like a Breakthrough Skill or a Fiendish or something, but it also kind of gives you the option to get a draw when it's destroyed, where a deck like this kind of, it's nice to be able to put your opponent in a weird situation in order to out your cards, because you will gain advantage pretty quickly in a lot of cases, especially with, you know, your Max Cs, or just the artifacts in general can be pretty annoying to deal with. But in general, if you open a copy of Junk Synchron or the Synchron Explorer, you're able to Mathematician and dump whichever other one you need. And then on your following turn, you can say summon Junk Synchron, bring back your Explorer, and make a level 5 Synchro, or vice versa. You're able to, you know, dump, I forget which one I just said, but either way, you dump whichever one you don't have and then use the other to bring it back. The other thing is with Synchro Fusionist, when it's used for a Synchro Summon, you're able to add a Polymerization or Fusion normal spell, or maybe it's just spell in general. I don't entirely remember. I know it just usually is used in a deck or format like this to add instant fusion, which means if you're able to, say, get this in graveyard and then go Junk Synchron, bring this back, Synchro into one of your 5s, you can then, for example, if you go into an Armades, you can then grab a copy of Instant Fusion, use Instant Fusion, and then be able to make a Pleiades, because now you have a level 5 Synchro and a level 5 Fusion, so they're both light, so then you can just go into that. So I think there's like really small niche synergies that are very nice, and obviously we're seeing lots of 3-ofs for the most part, so it's consistent at doing what it does. Looking at the spell cards, we see the 3 copies of Ignition, which is basic for the artifact package. We see 1 copy of Black and White Wave. This is a really kind of interesting card, and what it does is, while you have an Xyz that has a Synchro under it as material, you're able to banish a card. I think it's card on the field, and if you do, you draw a card, so kind of nice. It is a quick play as well. 1 copy of Dark Hole and the 2 copies of Double Cyclone to pair with, obviously, the 3 copies of Ignition. 2 copies of Instant Fusion, 1 copy of Rhoda, 2 copies of Soul Charge, and 3 copies of Tuning. I guess one other thing to note is, because you are playing things like Mathematician and Tuning, as well as, I guess, the Rhoda and stuff, there are a lot of ways to kind of go through your deck a little bit faster, so that's another reason why going over 40 isn't the biggest deal in a deck like this. For the traps, we see 3 copies of Sanctum, 1 copy of Bottomless, 3 copies of Call the Haunted, obviously working really well with your artifacts, as well as in certain cases being able to bring back, you know, your synchros, or just any piece you need to finish a synchro summon, or just use it to make a push. And then 1 copy of Warning and 1 copy of Torrential to round out the main deck. For the side deck, we see 1 extra copy of Scythe. Arm likes to always side 1 extra artifact, and usually it is the Scythe, so very normal to see that. Then they are having the 3 copies of Crow, just, you know, depending on the matchup, as I had mentioned previously. And also they are siding 1 copy of Crimson Blader, which can, you know, be made with one of the artifacts and the Junk Synchron, or just in general, if you have a level 5 Synchro and the Junk Synchron, you are able to make this, and this card is just, it can kind of just win games on its own, against decks like Mermail or any of the Ruler decks, or a handful of Rogue decks and stuff. This can be, you know, game changing. And then just 1 spell being the Mind Control, and then lots of traps. We're seeing 3 copies of Blackhorn, 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, 1 copy of Wiretap, and then 3 copies of Ironwall. I can't say how much I like seeing this card kind of popping up in decks a little more recently. Just being able to stop things like the Spellbook of Fate, the Rulers, and stuff like that, along with like a handful of like rogue options and stuff, as I said previously. This is just really good. Also, being able to activate this and turn off your opponent's debunks and crows and stuff like that can be really nice. Now, obviously, if they have a crow, they can just chain it to the activation of this, but it just kind of, once it's established, it's just really annoying for a lot of decks to deal with, kind of the way Necro Valley is as well. But obviously, a deck like this wouldn't want to play a Necro Valley because it'll turn off being able to move cards out of the graveyard via the effects of your Synchron monsters. But yeah, that's all I can really say with that. Looking at the extra deck, 2 copies of the Ojama Knight, 1 Cataster, 2 Armades, 1 copy of Leo, 1 magical android making a little appearance from Edison format, 1 copy of Stardust, and that is it for the Synchros and Fusions. For the Xyz, we see the 1 copy of Durendal, 2 copies of Pleiades, 1 M7, 1 Gaia Dragon, 1 Volcasaurus, and 1 copy of Tyrus. Honestly, I really like this. I think it's pretty cool. It's definitely something you don't see every day. And yeah, again, you guys can let me know what you think in the comment section, but let's move on to that last list, which should be a Evilswarm list. So last up, we do have Evilswarm, and this looks pretty standard. I feel like I've seen almost the same list before. I'm not entirely sure if it's just because in general Evilswarm plays a lot of the same monster lineup for the most part, or if maybe this is like someone else's lists, or maybe they've even topped before. I'm not entirely sure. But anyways, let's go through the card by card. I know a lot of people enjoy this deck. So it looks like they played the 3 Heliotrope, 3 Caster, 3 copies of the Kirkion, 3 copies of Mandragora, 3 copies of Thunderbird, and the 1 copy of Rabbit. And then they also chose to play 2 copies of Skullmeister, as this deck tends to have a really bad problem with the hands. And I'm going to say it again, I'm probably going to have to say it till the end of time, because people who are newer to Hat format or anything like that keep commenting in the comment section about how I'm wrong about the ruling of this. But what I can say is during Hat format, Skullmeister is able to work in the damage step. It's just how it's ruled. I know a lot of people find that weird, given that in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! That wouldn't be the case, and just in general. But yes, this card can stop the hands in damage step, so that's why you see a deck like Evilswarm playing this, as well as it's just kind of a good normal summon. It's a dark level 4 with 1700 attack, so at worst case scenario, compared to other different hand traps, you can actually summon this and start poking in for damage if need be. For the spells, they played 1 Dark Hole, 3 copies of Pandemic, 1 Mind Control, 2 MST, 1 Rhoda, 1 copy of Soul Charge, and 3 copies of Upstart Goblin. Usually you'll see some builds play the Upstart, some won't. I think the last build that topped might have played this. I don't entirely remember on that exactly. It's been a little while. For the traps, they play 1 copy of Blackhorn, 1 copy of Bottomless, 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, and 3 copies of Fiendish Chain. We've been seeing a lot more decks actually taking advantage of that ratio, which we originally saw in like Geargia decks, but now a lot more decks are just playing it. Fiendish Chain obviously stopping attacks because, as I mentioned before, the hands are pretty prevalent in the format right now. And then the 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, just because they're extra negates in graveyard, so it's really good against the artifacts and stuff, though this deck doesn't really have a problem against that because of cards like Ophion, though I guess there are times where it comes up, so just having that in general is very good. Or there's a ton of other decks that, you know, have kind of boss monsters or stuff that you do need to be able to just negate their effects on your turn. 1 copy of Infection, 1 Warning, and 1 Torrential. Overall, the main deck looks great. Let's move on to the side deck. They are on 3 copies of Maxi as the only monsters. You know, it makes sense. This deck doesn't really need a whole lot. Maybe they could have, like, sided an extra copy of Skullmeister if they really wanted to, but again, it's really just fine. We see the 1 copy of Dimensional Fissure and the 3rd copy of MST looks great. The 2nd copy of Blackhorn, 2 Debunk, 2 Light Imprisoning Mirror. I think this is really good to see. I feel like this is a card that with the amount of artifacts and Bujins and even Lightsworns topping recently, amongst other things, I feel like this card has potential to make a comeback. It had kind of fallen out of the format for a little bit, but I do think it is kind of cool to see. And in general, like it feels like a card that should be back in the format in certain cases, but it's also just not good into a lot of matchups with, hat format being so diverse. So it kind of makes sense, but I would like to see this pop up a little more. We will just have to see in the future. The one copy of Macro, the one copy of Neil Ceiling. I feel this is a little different, but if people are expecting some of the decks that kind of extend a little more, then this is kind of fine, especially since you can have protection with your Pandemic and stuff. So it's pretty cool to see. The one Soul Drain and 2 copies of Vanity's Emptiness. This is a deck that can take advantage of it, specifically because of cards like Key Beetle and stuff, but also just like in general, this deck, when you have Vanities plus Macro, this just becomes such a pain to actually deal with. But obviously, we're seeing this in the side over the main because in certain matchups, you really just don't want to be opening that going second, as I've always said. But let's take a look at the extra deck. They played 1 copy of Dweller, 1 copy of Diamond Direwolf, 1 Bahamut, 2 copies of Exciton, 3 Ophion, 1 Cowboy, 1 101, 1 Ragna Zero, 1 Black Ship of Corn, 1 Key Beetle, 1 Rhapsodian Berserk, and lastly, the 1 copy of Heartland Draco. Honestly, again, all 4 of these lists from this event have been pretty nice, and for the most part, something nice to see in general. But you can let me know in the comment section, again, what you thought of these different lists and in general of this breakdown for this event, and if you think I should be continuing to show off some of these smaller events, again, just to kind of show you guys what's actually going on in the format at the moment, or people's mindsets. I know it was a smaller tournament, but I do want to still bring you guys as much coverage as possible, and at least give you guys an idea of what's topping or what's around in the format. But anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like on it. Comment any questions or videos you want to see in the future. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell to get notified anytime I put a new video out. Share this video with your friends. And don't forget to check the video description so you can find out how you can actually participate in some of these online hat format tournaments. But anyways, guys, I will see you in the next video.